In this video, I'm going to be talking about pedigrees. And I have to admit that when I took the class, I thought this was the most tricky of the topics, so I can understand if people are having trouble. And if you are, don't feel nervous, it just takes a lot of practice to get the hang of them. I'm going to start with some basic nomenclature for pedigrees. So when you see it something like this is a pedigree. This big thing of circles and squares and lines connecting them. It's essentially the family tree of genetics. We denote females as circles, males as squares, and these diamonds denote that the sex of that person was unknown. This could happen either if the person died before birth, or if they are an expected child. So if two people are expecting to have a child, a diamond can depict that child. As for if someone has the disease or not, a filled in whatever shape it is means affected, and a not filled in of whatever shape is not affected. So if I had a filled in square, it would be an affected male. When we draw pedigrees, instead of just talking about like, oh, mother or grandmother, since there's so many people involved, that would be a pretty generic way of talking about them. So we set up this essentially grid system of saying who is who, where each row, each generation, is given a Roman numeral, and then each person in a given generation is given a number from left to right. It realistically doesn't matter, but as long as they're unique, that's the important thing. But the standard practice is that you start from 1 and you go right throughout the row. That way, if I'm talking about this son of this pair, I can just say 2, 2. Or if I'm talking about this son, I could say 2, 3. But notice how that is where some confusion could come. We don't know which of these two children we've been talking about. But now we do. 2, 2 or 2, 3. So for this, I'm going to be doing a basic practice problem. It's not really one that you'd expect on a test because it's a little too simple. But it just gives the gist of how you can think of pedigrees. So in this diagram, I have an unaffected female crossing with an affected male, and then these are their offspring. We denote that as a branch into these other offspring. This one was supposed to be a circle. Sorry, it's hard to draw with the mouse. But as we can see, we have this crossing ended up with 4 unaffected offspring. All 4 of them, no disease. 2 females and 2 males. Then I'm saying that this person, 2, 4, mates with an affected male, 2, 5, and then this is their offspring, the entire third row. We see that we have 2 affected children and 2 unaffected children. We have an unaffected female, an unaffected male, an affected female, and an affected male. So the first question would probably be, is this a recessive or a dominant trait? And right off the bat, we can jump to the conclusion that it's a recessive trait. And what I'm saying that from is the fact that it seems to skip a generation. Here we see this person has the trait, then none of that person's offspring have it, but then their offspring does have the trait. It resurfaces after a generation. Whenever you see this skipping a generation, that tips you off that it's recessive. From this, we can start actually putting genotypes. We know that if this person was affected and it's a recessive trait, I'm going to say little a, little a. I'll use a different color just to make it more clear. So this person must be little a, little a. If none of their children had it, we know that one allele must be dominant, and the fact that none of the children have it implies that the other one is also dominant. It could be heterozygous, but chances are, and then usually pedigrees are larger than this, it's probably homozygous because the chances of none of the children having it is pretty slim if it was heterozygous. So now that we have these, we know none of these are affected, and we know all of their genotypes. We know all of them are heterozygous. This person is affected, so again, we know their genotype. And then now their offspring. we know that if this one's unaffected, but they must have inherited the recessive allele, they must be big A, little a. And same as this person. These two are both affected, so they're little a, little a. Looking for these generation skips is the best first idea to jump to, because there is no way that it could be wrong. We're not dealing with potential probability of, oh, maybe it wasn't likely in this case, but it actually is it could happen. But after we figure out stuff based on generation skip, and we figure out all the genotypes, it's useful to go back and test it with ratios. I wouldn't use ratios as the main decider of dominant or recessive or any genotype stuff, because ratios are all based on probability. And even though they're probably correct, there is the chance that they're not. I would just use them to double check, okay, did this make sense? And if it did, do these also add up to it? So when we're looking through this, we see a cross between homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. We expect from doing a Punnett square that none of the children would be affected, which is what happens. So the ratio is 4 to 0, I guess, 1 to 0. 100% don't have it, 0% have it. This person is affected, we were given that. If none of these people have it, but they had to have inherited the recessive, we already derived that they had to have been heterozygous. If we cross a heterozygous with a homozygous recessive, we would predict that about half the children would be affected, and the other half would be heterozygous. And looking at our pedigree, this does suggest it. It didn't have to, but it happens to work out, which is a nice verification in the back of our mind. In general, these are the two main things to look for. When you start dealing with more complex traits, you might have other turnouts, but if you're looking for recessiveness, look for a generation skip, and if you see one, that guarantees it's recessive. And then look at the ratios. There's other tricks, but those all purely depend on probability and just tricks of the trade as you get the hang of them.